Good afternoon, folks. It is such a privilege to be here at the Ashbrook Center, and I just want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank those of you who are supporters, financial supporters of this great institution. This is my second trip here, and it's just so wonderful to see how this center has grown and influenced and just flourished over the years. So continue, please, to support this institution and these young people who are going to be the future leaders of our country, and they're conservative too, so that's wonderful. I'm just very thrilled to be here. I do write for the Wall Street Journal. How many of you read the Wall Street Journal pretty regularly? Please keep reading. And thank you for helping pay my salary. It is a great newspaper. By the way, out of the 5 major newspapers in the country today, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Times, LA Times, and the Washington Post, only one of those newspapers has an increase in its circulation. Anybody want to guess what newspaper that is? The Wall Street Journal, so we're very proud of that. And by the way, I don't know how many of you saw, but the New York Times readership is down so much. That newspaper is about this close to being in federal bankruptcy court, and it couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. I don't want to be quoted on that, but anyway, so. And I also am very privileged to, as many of you know, about 3 years ago, Rupert Murdoch bought the Wall Street Journal, so now we have a strategic partnership with Fox News, and that's been a lot of fun working at Fox. How many Fox News viewers are there here? A lot of you are. What would we do without Fox News, right? And by the way, Fox News now at night has a larger audience than MSNBC, CNBC, and CNN combined, so that's wonderful news as well. But, you know, when you picked me up last night, and it was pretty late at night, and I was coming through the airport terminal in Akron, right? We were in Akron, and this sweet little old lady, she saw me, and she just ran up to me, and she threw her arms around me. It was very, very endearing and cute, and she was so funny. She said, "I know you, don't I?" I said, "Well, ma'am, I'm not really sure." She said, "I'm sure I've seen you on TV." And I was kind of kidding along with her at this point, and I said, "Well, I'm not sure, ma'am." I said, "What do you watch?" And that kind of flummoxed her, and she scratched her head, and she looked up at me again. She said, "Wait a minute," she said, "didn't I see you on Wheel of Fortune last week?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, that was me." You know, Fox News is doing wonderfully, and it's great to be. And you all know, by the way, the philosophy of Fox News is fair, balanced, and blonde, right? Fair, balanced, and blonde. But I've met a lot of beautiful women at Fox News. You know, one of the things that I am going to be serious and talk a little bit about what's going on in the economy and politics, but I just wanted to tell you, if I could, one fun story about something that we do at the Wall Street Journal, which is once a week, for those of you who get our weekend paper, you know, in my editorial page, we do a long interview with a famous person and someone who's done something remarkable with their life. And I've interviewed everybody from Barack Obama to John McCain to Fred Smith, the CEO of Federal Express, to Charles Schwab. So I've met a lot of really interesting people doing these interviews. But about 2 years ago, I met one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life. And that was a man by the name of Art Linkletter. Now, how many of you in this room remember Art Linkletter? None of the kids do, none of the students do, certainly not none of the high school students. But Art Linkletter, when I interviewed him, was 97 years old. He lived up in Hollywood, up in the Avenue of the Stars, and it was really just fun to meet him. And you know, he actually died about 6 months after I interviewed him, so I was privileged to be one of the last people to actually do an interview with Art Linkletter. For the young people in this room who don't know who Art Linkletter was, he was not only one of the first voices on radio, but he made the transition to TV, and he had, you know, these famous TV shows in the 50s and 60s. I remember I asked him, I said, "Art, how big were you back then in the 50s and 60s?" He said, "Steve," he said, "I was Oprah before there was Oprah." That's pretty big. But do you all remember his famous show that he had, Kids Say the Darndest Things? And it was just so fun to interview him. He was so chatty, and I said, "Well, out of all those interviews you did of all the years," I said, "what was your favorite story?" And without hesitation, he said, "Well, Steve, one time this little boy came on the air, and in the middle of this interview, he's about 7 years old, this little boy starts crying, and the tears are just streaming down his cheeks, and I turned to the little boy and I said, 'Son, why are you crying? Why are you so sad today?' And the little boy says, 'Well, Mr. Linkletter, my dog just died.'" And so Art kind of consolingly put his arm around this little boy and said, "Son, I just want you to know you shouldn't feel so sorry about your dog dying." He said, "Because I want to assure you of something. Your dog right now is up in heaven with God." And the little boy turns to Art Linkletter and says, "Well, Mr. Linkletter, what would God want with a dead dog?" And I just thought that was such a fun story. And only I could tell him. Okay, so let me give you some perspectives on what's going on with this economy, and let me start, if I may, talking about two issues that I think are front and center on the obviously on the political landscape right now. And the first is obviously health care. And you all, I'm sure, are following what's going on with this debate in front of the Supreme Court. And I will simply say this, that I believe this is the most important Supreme Court decision we will hear from the court in the last 30 years. I really believe that. The implications of this decision are enormous, and not just because of health care. This goes well beyond whether this health care law, Obamacare, is unconstitutional. It really goes to the heart of the matter about whether there are constitutional guardrails against unlimited government. And, you know, it was James Madison who called the Supreme Court the bulwark of our liberties. You may have seen a couple of days ago that President Obama was almost contemptuous of the idea that the Supreme Court could possibly invalidate this law. He even said it passed by this overwhelming margin. Yeah, like 3 votes in the House and about 1 vote in the Senate. But he was saying, you know, how dare the courts interfere with the democratic process? Well, that's not interfering. That's why we have a Supreme Court, right, is to determine whether laws passed by the Congress pass muster under the Constitution. And the good news is, for those of you who are conservatives like me who believe in limited government and limitations on the power of government, that I believe, after reviewing the 3 days of oral arguments, I believe, and if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, what are the chances that the Supreme Court is going to invalidate this law, I would have said maybe 50-50 at best. But after listening to those arguments by the court, I truly believe we have about a 90% chance now of ruling out, of invalidating the individual mandate. And this is important. I mean, that is great news, isn't it? And the reason this is important, and I think the Supreme Court justices got this. They've got to the heart of the issue, which is if the Congress and the federal government can command you to buy a product, what can't they require you to do? And this is something that the justices, even Kennedy, obviously most of you know Kennedy is the swing vote on the court. We have 4 conservatives, 4 liberals, Justice Kennedy. And even Justice Kennedy was saying, well, what can't the federal government do if the federal government has the authority under the Commerce Clause to basically say that you must buy health insurance? And so I am just feeling very positive about this because I do believe Obamacare is one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation that I've seen in the 40 years that I've been studying policy. Now, the other issue that I wanted to bring up, and I want to bring this up now because it's on my mind, and I just got back 2 weeks ago from a trip to North Dakota. You're probably wondering, what the hell is in North Dakota? Well, North Dakota, what is going on in North Dakota these days with the oil and gas boom is such an amazing, untold story. It is something that just makes you feel great about America when you realize what's going on there. I mean, you go to these small towns in North Dakota. I was in Williford, North Dakota. Williston, North Dakota. Williston is a town. You feel like you're going back to the days of the gold rush during the gold rush. Where you literally. I mean, it's almost $1,000 a night to stay at a hotel in Williston. Everybody's moving to North Dakota. North Dakota, by the way, has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. How many of you knew that? North Dakota, of all the states, has the lowest unemployment rate. And when you tell people in North Dakota their unemployment rate is 3%, they laugh at that. There's not 3% unemployment in North Dakota. There are 25,000 unfilled jobs. It's amazing. Truckers are getting $100,000 a year. Pipe fitters are going, making all this money. There was a story when I was out there that even the strippers from Las Vegas are moving to North Dakota because they can make more money now in North Dakota than they can in Vegas. So, I mean, you've got this boom going on there. And what's happening, ladies and gentlemen, is this oil and gas boom that is so enormous. It is just incredible. And through new technologies, hydraulic fracking, they're able to drill 2 miles down deep into the ground and then 2 miles, what's called horizontal drilling, which is a new technology that allows them in one rig to go down 2 miles down and then 2 miles in any direction and pull out this oil that has been trapped there for hundreds of years through fracking. By the way, anyone who is against the process of hydraulic fracking, that's like being against a cure for cancer. I mean, this is such an enormous breakthrough in terms of our ability as a nation to become energy independent. It is breathtaking to think that they can crack through these 4 inches of like solid rock And what happens is once they crack through that, through pushing water and sand and other chemicals into these rocks, they burst through the rocks, and then all of this oil and gas is trapped there, and it's sucked out like champagne bottle from when the cork is taken out, and they're just sucking up enormous amounts of oil and natural gas. And the thing that is so exciting about that is that North Dakota, they just discovered a lower shelf of oil beneath the Bakken Shale there. North Dakota, ladies and gentlemen, one state has more oil than Saudi Arabia has oil. Isn't that amazing? One state has more. Barack Obama says we cannot drill our way out of this crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, we can drill our way out of this crisis. And the same thing, by the way, is going on in states like Ohio, here, in Pennsylvania, and in states like West Virginia. I recently got back from Wheeling, West Virginia. How many of you have been to Wheeling, West Virginia? Or a lot of you probably have around here. I mean, Wheeling, West Virginia, you went there 10 years ago, the last time I was there. I mean, it was one of the most depressing towns you'll ever go to. It was the epicenter of the Rust Belt, right, with closed down steel factories and closed down stores, every other house in foreclosure. You go to Wheeling, West Virginia today, the town is absolutely booming. Farmers are getting millions of dollars for leases on their land to dig into the Marcellus Shale. It's such an incredibly uplifting story. I mean, it's booming so much in Wheeling, West Virginia, they're opening BMW dealerships in Wheeling, West Virginia. So what I'm saying is that if we get our energy policies right in Washington, we have the capacity within 10 years, and think about the implications of this. In 10 years, the United States can be an oil and natural gas exporter, not an importer. That is amazing when you think about it. That means rather than about $400 billion a year of our money going to countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela, many countries that are hostile to us, we can actually be taking money from those countries, and that has an enormous impact for our economy. Meanwhile, the president keeps spending money on things like solar and wind power, which, in my opinion, and all the facts show, are fringe energy sources. After spending billions of dollars on wind and solar, anybody want to take a guess at how much of our energy and electricity supply today comes from wind and solar power? 2.3%. 2.3%. Even if we quadruple the amount of energy that we get from wind and solar power, Mr. President, where are we going to get the other 90%? So if you ask me, I'm a drill baby drill guy. I think we have the capacity to just be an incredible energy exporter, and it will do enormous good for our economy. Now, what went wrong? What went wrong over the last 3 or 4 years? Why has this been the deepest and severest recession that we've had since the Great Depression? Why is it that normally at this time of the stage of an economic recovery, if I can use that word recovery, because a lot of Americans don't believe we're even in a recovery yet, although the economy has really picked up a lot in the last 6 months, but we are still 5 million jobs short of where we were back in 2007. That's incredible. We're still at negative 5 million jobs from where we were when the recession began. Every other post-World War II recession, we've had 7 previous World War II recessions, every one of them, not only had we recovered every job lost, but we had gained jobs by now. So we have put ourselves in an enormous hole. And I would submit to you that the reason this economic plan hasn't worked, and I'm not being partisan here, because I think you go back to 2008, the last year of the Bush administration, and the first 3 years of the Obama administration, and every single policy that has been put in place by Washington has been exactly the wrong thing to do. Every step that Washington has taken has made, in my opinion, this recession much deeper and much more severe than it would have been or could have been. And then you think about the numbers and what we've done to our economy and the damage that will last. I mean, there are so many students here that are going to pay the price, not just the students here, but there's the students, the kids of those students and the grandkids of those students. When you consider that just in the last 4 years, in 4 years' time, we have increased the national debt by $5 trillion. $5 trillion. There's a saying in Washington these days that a trillion is the new billion, and there's a lot of truth to that, unfortunately. When I first came to Washington in the 1980s, when you worked in the Reagan administration, we didn't talk about the budget in the trillions of dollars. We talked about it in the billions of dollars. But now we're talking about it in the trillions of dollars. I saw a sign the other day at a Tea Party rally, and it was so great. The sign said, "Thank God Barack Obama doesn't know what comes after a trillion." Thank God he doesn't. I mean, but these numbers are gigantic. By the way, anybody in this room know how many zeros there are on a trillion? There are 12 zeros in a trillion. $1 trillion is $1 million. The reason I think the American people aren't even angrier than they are about this fiscal abuse that's been taken on over the last 4 years is the numbers have become so gigantic we can't even get our arms around them. You know, I have 3 sons. I have 2 teenagers who I don't like very much, but then I have an 8-year-old who I'm very fond of. And, you know, when I'm at home at night, I try to tell a story to my 8-year-old, a bedtime story. And one night I thought I would tell my son a story about the national debt, because after all, he's going to have to repay it, so I thought he should know something about it. So I said, David, do you know who is the greatest basketball player in the world? And he instantly said LeBron James. So then I asked him, well, David, how much money does LeBron James make? And my son knows like everything about the NBA. He's an encyclopedic knowledge about the NBA. So he instantly said $40 million when you include all his contracts and his endorsements. And by the way, is this a great country or what, that you can make $40 million a year to play basketball? So then I posed this question to my son, David, and I'll pose the same one to you all. I said, David, how many seasons do you think LeBron James would have to play basketball at $40 million a year to have $1 trillion? The answer is 25,000 seasons. I mean, doesn't that give you a perspective of how much we have sinned and how off course we've gotten economically? Now, if we stay on the course that we're on right now, we will see over the next 10 years, under what I call the Obama baseline, another $10 trillion of debt added to that. Now, let's put that in perspective. That means that over the next 10 years, if we don't change course, if we don't change directions, if we don't turn this Titanic around before it hits the iceberg, if we don't change, we will borrow more money in the next 10 years than the United States government borrowed from 1776 through 2005. It's astounding, isn't it? That means we're going to borrow more money in the next 10 years than we borrowed to finance the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, and the Cold War. Amazing. And so we have dug ourselves into quite an economic hole. And a lot of this was generated, a lot of this debt, in this false belief. I talked to the students this morning about this false belief that government spending creates jobs. But you all know government spending doesn't create jobs because, as Milton Friedman taught us, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If the government spends $1, the dollar has to come from somewhere. And this is the central premise of the left's ideology, that we could spend more by the government and somehow, they believe in what I call tooth fairy economics. There's some tooth fairy out there that's giving away free money. And all we have done, in my opinion, with this avalanche of spending, and by the way, if you think about all the programs we've had. Remember, we had the $830 billion fiscal stimulus that was supposed to bring the unemployment rate down to less than 8%. That was an obvious failure. Then we had, remember, the Cash for Clunkers program. We were going to pay people to buy cars. Then we spent $400 billion on mortgage modification programs, giving money to people who aren't paying their mortgages. I have a bumper sticker on my car that says, honk if I paid your mortgage. Everywhere I go, people are honking at me, because everybody's paying for everybody else's mortgage. This is out of control. And what we need right now more than anything is we need a policy that brings this debt and this government spending down. Now, I am a big believer that the president who got this right was Ronald Reagan. And I love that man, and it's interesting. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal about a couple of months ago that drove liberals crazy, and I just called it Reaganomics versus Obamanomics. And what I did is I said, look, these two presidents had something very much similar that defined their presidency. Both Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama took office during great economic crises. Right? Reagan did, obviously, with the great inflation and the deindustrialization of America that happened in the 70s. Obama takes office in the middle of this housing wipeout and so on. And they both used completely different approaches to deal with the crisis, right? Reagan came in, he cut taxes, he got inflation down, he reduced government spending on the domestic side, deregulated the economy, and the economy boomed. In fact, at this stage of the economic cycle under Ronald Reagan, the economy grew by 8% in one quarter. We had so many, we had 1 month under Reagan in October of 2003 when the U.S. economy created 1.1 million jobs in 1 month. That's fewer jobs than this president will create in an entire year. So when you compare and contrast these policies, we know that what works and what doesn't. Now, could somebody put up the first, I wanted to show you a few pictures. I want to show you this. I'm a big believer that one of the things that is so important, that turned around the economy in the 80s and really caused the big growth of the economy in the 80s and 90s, is what happened with tax rates. I think that Reagan came in and did two things that are so important that Barack Obama doesn't understand. First, he cut the tax rates, and second, he cut the inflation. Look at this. You can see the red line is the highest tax rate paid by the richest 1% in America. I'm sorry, that's the highest tax rate that was charged Americans. Do you all remember, how many remember when we have 70% tax rate in the 1970s? You can see that on there. And you can see Reagan came in with Jack Kemp and others and made the case that those tax rates were so high, they were suffocating the economy. So the rate was cut from 70 to 50%. This is the red line. And then you can see a few years after that, the top tax rate, that went from 50 to 28%. Now that's a big deal. That means that at the start of the decade, with a 70% tax rate, you only got to keep 30 cents on the dollar, right? Because if you're paying 70 cents on the dollar, you only get to keep 30 cents. By the end of the decade, at a 28% tax rate, you got to keep 72 cents on the dollar. So the after-tax rate of return on working and investing more than doubled. It's not too surprising the economy exploded. Then you can see the rate went up a little bit and down a little bit in the next few years, but the main point is, over that whole period, the top tax rate in the United States went from 70 to 35%. Now, here is what's so exciting and interesting about this chart. Look at the blue line, ladies and gentlemen. That is the share of taxes paid by the richest 1% in America. And by the way, as wonderful it is to talk to you all today, I cannot tell you how much I wish, sitting at this front table right here, were Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Tim Geithner, and some of the other economic advisors, because when it comes to tax policy, I simply think the Obama administration does not have their tray table in the upright and locked position. Now, look at this. I mean, look at what happened. As the tax rate came down, look at what happened to the share of taxes paid by the richest 1%. Went up. That's like a paradox. The rate went down and the tax collections from the top 1% went up. This is what the Obama administration doesn't get. If Barack Obama were sitting right here, I'd say, Mr. President, with all due respect, if you want to soak the rich, if you want to get more money out of rich people, cut their tax rate, don't raise it. Now, could you show the next chart, please? This is one of my favorite quotations from history, and it contradicts so much what Barack Obama said yesterday when he gave his speech on the economy, when he kept talking about trickle-down economics, and it doesn't work, and it's never worked, and so on. He is completely wrong. And this is from John F. Kennedy. He said this 3 months before he was tragically assassinated in Dallas in 1963. Kennedy was promoting a big tax cut the way Reagan did and George W. Bush did. And here's what John F. Kennedy did. I want to read it to you because I love this quote so much. He said, "In short, it is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today," and this is the part I love, "and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now." Exactly the opposite of what Barack Obama wants to do, where he wants to increase the capital gains tax by 60%, triple the dividend tax, and increase the tax on small businesses. Now, if you'll show the next chart, this is one I just think is really fascinating when it gets, because the next 4 months, you're going to hear more and more about tax fairness. President Obama is going to say over and over again, the rich don't pay their fair taxes. You're going to have people like Warren Buffett making this case for him. But look at this chart, ladies and gentlemen. The red line is the share of taxes paid by the bottom 95% of Americans, and the blue line is the chart, the line I just showed you, the share of taxes paid by the richest 1 out of 100 Americans. And look at that. In 2007, for the first time in American history, those lines crossed, which means for the first time in American history, the top 1 out of 100 Americans paid more in income tax than the bottom 95 out of 100. Now, how in the world can you look at that chart and say the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes? I mean, I can't tell you how much I wish Tim Geithner were here to explain that to me. Now, if you show the next chart, this is the other part of the equation that I think is really interesting, inflation. Most of the young people in this room are way too young to remember what happened in the 1970s, but how many in this room are old enough to remember 14% inflation under Jimmy Carter? Remember that? Anybody remember the 20% mortgage interest rates we had in 1980? That was the 70s. That was the era of Jimmy Carter. I always say the reason I know that God smiles on America is that Jimmy Carter was not reelected in 1980. And by the way, as bad a president as Jimmy Carter was, isn't he an even worse ex-president than he was a president? I mean, every time he says something, he puts his foot in his mouth. Anyway, then you see what happens. The clouds disperse, the sun comes out, God gives a mountain miracle, Ronald Reagan. Look at what happened to the inflation rate. The inflation rate in 1 year went from 14% to 3%. Under Reagan, this is what I call the Reagan-Volcker disinflation. For the next 20 years, you can see that we had a very strong and stable currency with very manageable inflation rates. That, I think, was one of the things that really powered that expansion we had in the 80s and 90s. And the reason I show you that is if you'll show this next chart, I think this is something that might, can you put the next chart up, please? Here's what's happened to our money supply. Some of you may have seen this chart before. If you haven't, I find it to be very frightening. Look at what happened to the supply of money that is being put out there in the economy starting in 2008 during the economic crisis. What this is saying is that Bernanke doubled the supply of money. It was, we call him Helicopter Ben because it was almost like he literally went up over cities in helicopters and dumped $100 bills out the window. And you can see the massive expansion. What this is saying is there's twice as many dollars out there in the U.S. economy today as there were in 2007. Now, an elementary economics question. What is the long-term implication of printing all that money? Inflation, right? I mean, you know that from your Economics 100 class. Inflation is just too many dollars chasing too few goods. That is, I think, a scary picture, and it's one reason why one of the things that worries me about the future is whether we're going to start to see inflation rear its ugly head. If you'll show the next chart, this is the interest rate picture for the economy, and it's an amazing story, really. Look at that. You can see what happened in the 60s and 70s when interest rates went up and up and up, and then you want to see a beautiful picture, ladies and gentlemen. Look at what's happened since 1981 with interest rates in this country. We have had a 30-year secular decline in interest rates, almost unprecedented in history. So much so that interest rates today on a 10-year Treasury bond are 2%. Now, I think you had me, when was it, about 10 years ago I was here? Okay, I'm going to be willing to make a bet with anybody in this room of up to 100, any and all takers of $100, that if you're nice enough to have me back 10 years from now, I will bet anyone in this room $100 that interest rates will be higher 10 years from now than they are today. Anybody want to take me up on that? It's not a very bold bet, is it, right? Because interest rates cannot virtually go any lower than that. I mean, people are buying 2% Treasury bill notes today with 3% inflation. What that means is people are buying Treasury notes, T-bills, bonds, with a negative real rate of inflation. Why are people doing that? Why would people pay? We're essentially paying the government to hold on to our money for us. And the answer to that question is simple. People are still afraid. We have so many anti-growth policies coming out of Washington. The tax increases, the regulatory burdens, the debt, all of these things are it's almost like everybody's in this cocoon. We're afraid to invest. One of the reasons, by the way, I'm actually optimistic about the economy. I do believe if we get a new set of policies in Washington and we take away that tax increase threat and some of these other threats, I believe you're going to see this economy boom like you've never seen it before. There's $2 trillion of money that's just sitting out there being invested in passive bonds or almost literally being stuffed under people's mattresses that's not being invested because people are afraid. And once you lift that wet blanket cloak of fear, you're going to see a big boom in this country. And that's why the elections are so important in November. Now, showing the next chart, if you will, this is one of my favorites. And this is just, it's interesting. When you talk about inflation, if you look at consumer products, I know there are a lot of businessmen and women in this room who provide the basic consumer products that we use every day. If you look at things like cars and trucks, if you look at things like clothing, computer software, computers, those things have been falling in price over the last 10 years. We've had disinflation in most consumer items. I always say that the person who helped poor people the most of any person in the history of the world is probably Sam Walton for starting Walmart and making things so cheap and affordable to the average American. And you can see that when you have competition, prices fall, it's good for consumers, and it's good for American workers. Now look at the two industries, if you will, where we've had the greatest increase in inflation. Now let's put energy aside, because energy is a kind of a commodity. But education and healthcare, ladies and gentlemen, are the two industries where we've had the most inflation. What is similar about those two industries, education and healthcare? Well, let me pose that question a different way. Who supplies education and healthcare in this country? The government, right? These are the two industries in America that are most controlled by government. Education is about 80% government funded, and healthcare today is exactly 50% public and 50% private. I mentioned that I have two teenagers. One of my sons goes to Northwestern out in Evanston. Ladies and gentlemen, what universities, notwithstanding this great university, what most universities in this country are charging in tuition today is one of the great acts of theft in American history. I mean, this is stealing what's going on with universities. Anybody want to take a guess at what Northwestern is costing me as a parent right now? All in, room, board, and tuition? I heard somebody say 55,000. $61,000 a year. $61,000 a year. So I'll tell you this, the day my son was going off to college, I said, Justin, he's packing his bags, I said, look, I'll make a deal for you. Because I'm conservative, I don't like the idea of going to this liberal university anyway. So I said, David, Justin, I'll make a deal for you. You can go to Northwestern for 4 years, or I will just write you a check for $200,000. You play computer games for 4 years, and we'll both be better off. He said, yeah, that sounded pretty good to him. But I mean, you have to start asking, university is really worth $200,000 a year. It's a big problem. And I think the similarity between those two industries is that what you've got in both of those industries is a disconnection between the people who are getting the services and the people who are paying for it. And that's certainly the problem with healthcare, which is going to be made worse with Obamacare. I was telling the kids, that Mitt Romney gave this speech the other day, and this kid at Bradley University said, Governor Romney, what I want from government is free birth control. It's like, well, you know what? Somebody has to pay for it, right? Somebody's going to have to pay for it if this girl has free birth control. And that's the problem with this entitlement mentality. Now, if you'll show the next chart, I'm coming to an end here. But one of the reasons to feel so optimistic about the economy is the explosion of technology, and especially for young people in the room. If you look at how long it took for things to be invented, like you can see here that it took 70 years for the telephone to be affordable to the average American from the time that Alexander Graham Bell invented it. It took 50 years for radio. It took 20 years for TV. Look, as we move into this technological age, and this is what's so exciting about being alive today, is that we're at the cusp of this incredible digital age that's changing our society so radically right before our very eyes. Look at these things like, the cell phones and DVD players and the internet, how rapidly they became instantly affordable and available. They were democratized at an incredibly swift pace. When I talk to young people, and I give about 10 or 15 lectures a year on college campuses, I've noticed lately these kids are so dour and dire, and they think, oh, things are so horrible in America today. Why do I have to be alive today during these horrible times? I'm like, horrible times? They say, how many of you kids have a laptop computer? They all raise their hand. How many have the internet? They all raise their hands. How many of you have cell phones? They all raise their hands. How many of you have iPods? I mean, half of the kids listen to the iPods while I give my lectures, so they all have these things, right? So they don't even get it. And then they look and they're like, dude, well, of course we have these things. Of course we have these things. Because our kids, and my two teenagers are just like this. They think like living with iPods and cell phones and the internet is like living in a prehistoric age, right? Now, show the next chart, if you will. Look at that. Now, anybody know what movie that's from? Wall Street. Now look at that. That movie was made in 1987. 1987, not so long ago, right? Look at that thing he's got, Michael Douglas is holding in his hand. That's like a brick with an antenna coming out of it. And here's the amazing part. If you want to see progress, if you want to see how our free market system creates wealth and progress, that cell phone that he held in his hand, in 1987, that cost $4,200. $4,200 that now they damn near give them away for free. We were talking about at lunch, now they've got these new cell phones that talk back to you. Who was the first president of the United States? All these things. It's just amazing, the technology that's going on. So that's just so exciting. Now, the last point I want to make, and then I want to take your questions. If you'll show the next chart. This is the big problem. This is the crux of the problem. Everything is going so well for this country, except we have government out of control. And you can see what happens here. You can see that the red line is the defense budget. The blue line is our non-defense budget. You can see what happens with in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, who was a very fiscally conservative president, and we had Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House. You can see that there's very little growth of the budget. Then, unfortunately, this makes me embarrassed, ladies and gentlemen, to tell you this as a Republican. Look at what happened when the Republicans took over in 2001. Look what happened to the budget. It went through the roof. Now, the red line went up because of, I believe, President Bush did the right thing in terms of increasing spending after 9/11 on the war on terror, and I think that certainly paid off when we finally killed that son of a bitch, bin Laden. But look at the blue line. Look at what happened with the blue line. I mean, that was one of the great days in America. But look at the blue line. At the same time we're spending all this money for guns, we're spending more money for butter as well. And this is all the healthcare spending, the education spending. And in 2006, Republicans got chased out of office because people said, look, you're spending like Democrats do. If we want champion spenders, we'll elect the Democrats. And you can see in 2006 is when Nancy Pelosi became Speaker. And then in 2008, Barack Obama became president. And folks, I mean, look at what happened to the budget under Barack Obama. Instead of, in my opinion, what caused our recession, this what we're calling now the Great Recession, was overspending, right, overborrowing, and too much leverage by government, individuals, and businesses. What we should have been done, not run the deficit through the roof, we should have actually been contracting the government and reining it in and fixing its balance sheet. We did just the opposite. And so that's the danger. And the thing that's so infuriating about this is if you show the next chart, you can see that this is where your dollars go when they're sent to Washington. And this is based on a very sophisticated study, but you can see, you know, for those of you who can't read this, it's, you know, half of your tax dollars are down a rat hole, pissed away, you know, or spent on postage stamps. So that's based on a very sophisticated study. All right, let me wrap up and simply say this. I believe the single most important for our country going forward over the next not just 2, 5, 10 years, but the next 20 and 30 and 50 years, is will this great country of ours, the United States of America, retain its status as the economic superpower on this planet? And there's no question for all of our lifetimes, at least since the end of World War II, the United States has been the economic superpower, the military superpower, and I believe Ronald Reagan was right. We have been a force for good, not for evil. But now, for the first time in any of our lifetimes, we do have a rival. We do have a rival who is catching up with us, and that is, of course, China. And what's happened in China, but, you know, I gave a lecture to the kids today and was talking about the supremacy of capitalism versus socialism. If you want a prime example of that, look at what has happened in China in the last 30 years. I mean, China is a country that for hundreds of years couldn't even feed itself. Mao Zedong, you know, starved to death tens of millions of his own people. Now China is growing at a 12% rate. It's amazing. Their living standards are doubling every 10 or 15 years. It's an amazing accomplishment. So we had this meeting with this Chinese economic minister, and the Chinese economic minister at the Journal said to us, he said, within 8 years, he believed, China was going to surpass the United States. He said, you know, we're going to catch you in 2019, and then once we catch you, there's a speed value like you're, you know, we're looking at you through our rearview mirror. And, you know, I couldn't take this much longer. I mean, you cut me, I bleed red, white, and blue, so I burst out of my chair at this editorial meeting. I said, sir, with all due respect, I don't think China is ever going to catch the United States in terms of our economy and yours. And I said, even though I want to salute you for what you've done in the last 20 years in terms of reducing so much poverty in your country, the reason China is never going to surpass the United States, sir, is our Chinese are so much smarter than your Chinese. And he didn't like that very much, but it's right. You know, it's true, right? Our Chinese are smart. But here's the point. We've got to get serious about competitiveness. We've got to bring our taxes down. We've got to get our debt down. We've got to get government spending down. And we've got to get the government off the back of these industries like energy and like healthcare, and then you're going to see a spectacular boom that is going to be such an enriching future for every young person in this room. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
It's always a question whether I can turn this thing on. Is it on?
You can ask up here.
First question. With Obama calling the Ryan budget plan an attempt at social Darwinism, how do we market effective spending cuts? That is to say, how do we make cuts politically acceptable for people?
Boy, is that a tough question. It really is. I mean, how do you make, I mean, you worked in the Reagan administration. You know how hard it was to cut agencies. But, you know, I just believe the American people are ready. I think we can have an adult conversation about Medicare, about Medicaid, about Social Security, about the fact that these things are going bankrupt, that we're going right off this cliff. And I think one of the things that really makes this case all the more persuasive than it has ever been is to observe, ladies and gentlemen, what is happening in Europe today. I mean, Europe is simply a gigantic welfare state. They've become an entitlement state that is simply unaffordable, and you see the crashing of those economies. I mean, look, I don't think we're Greece. I don't like those comparisons between the United States and Greece. But Greece is basically looking in through the windshield and seeing what happens when countries' economy, when their governments grow out of control and everybody becomes entitled to everybody else's money, which is what's happened in Greece. I mean, you have nobody's working, everybody wants a government pension check or a government paycheck, and that simply doesn't work anymore. And what you've seen is the bonds have gone from 4% interest rates to 20% interest rates. Everybody's selling off Greece bonds. You've got violence in the streets of Athens. That, in my opinion, is what happens if we don't start turning these things around. Now, look, I believe we have about 3, 4, 5, or 10 years to get this thing turned around before the 80 million baby boomers start to retire and become collectors of all of these benefits. But I think the American people are out ahead of the politicians on this. How many of you were with me on this? We've got to cut this budget down to size, right? I mean, it has got to be cut, and it's got to be cut now. And what I would do is I would cut every agency by about 10 or 15%, right? Just a haircut of every agency. A lot of businessmen and women here, you know, during the tough times, you had to cut your budgets. You worked in the government, you know, and look, these agencies can take that kind of cut without cutting the vital services that we get from government. But if we don't do this, I mean, I mentioned China. Guess who owns more U.S. Treasury bonds than any other country? China does. If we're going to compete with them, how do we compete with them if we owe them $1 trillion? And so that's, I think, the explanation we have to make to the American people. And look, I also think that there are programs. I like what Paul Ryan's talking about, Medicaid, move it back to the states, let people in Ohio deal with, you know, have their system, or Wisconsin, Florida. I've talked to a lot of these governors. They say, yeah, give us the power of reforming these programs ourselves. So I love that. And by the way, the one that just sticks in my craw is National Public Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, can't George Soros pay for that himself?
A related question, what are the differences or benefits of the economic plans of the Republican presidential candidates? Follow-up, what would be a prudent plan to reform our tax system?
Well, first of all, I have to say this. You know, the presidential candidate, we're not at the Journal allowed to endorse candidates and stuff, but I can say this now that he's out of the race. The guy I really loved was Herman Cain. And I just thought Herman had an incredible economic program. I loved his idea of 999, getting tax rates down to 9%. I loved his idea. I love the idea of having someone who understands business in the White House. Because this is, you know, and look, I'm not here to bash the president. I think he's got a wonderful family. I think the fact that we have a black president is really one of the great milestones of our country. He's a nice person. I've met him many times. But one of his flaws, I think, is that he's never really worked for a business or really even started a business. And it's hard to understand how business works if you've never done it, if you've never met a payroll. And I like that about Herman Cain. The fact is, and I like that, quite frankly, about Mitt Romney. Look, I think Mitt Romney is charismatically challenged. I think he's going to have a hard time against, you know, look, Barack Obama's a great talker. He's a very charismatic character. I've always said the 3 people I've met in my lifetime who are the best politicians in terms of their ability to communicate a message with the American people: Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. There was just something special about those guys. Now, here's the interesting thing I wanted to say to you all. I do believe the Republicans have a person who has that X factor. You know who that is? It's not Mitt Romney. Who said that? Chris Christie. I mean, Chris Christie has that ability to reach out and connect with the American people. You know, and you know, I told you this at lunch, but I talked to Chris because I know him very well, and I told him, Chris, I think you made a big mistake in not running for president this year. And he said, Steve, I just didn't feel like this was my time. And I said, Chris, a poll just came out that shows that 40% of Americans are obese. You have 40% of the electorate all wrapped up, right? And he didn't buy that. But look, I like the flat tax a lot. I think the idea of getting our tax rates down as low as possible. I told the students this morning. If we could go from a country that has the highest corporate tax rate in the world to the lowest, I like our odds under that. You know, why would we want to have the highest corporate tax rate in the world? It is unpatriotic to support such a system. I mean that. It is unpatriotic. I use that word deliberately because it's hard for American countries to compete if they have this albatross around their neck. It means every country we compete with has a 10 or 15% advantage right from the get-go. Why would we want to do that? Why wouldn't we want to give a fair advantage to the United States rather than put our competitors at an advantage?
We have a time for 2 more, maybe, depending on the length of your responses. We know that the government's response to the latest recession has not been helpful and, in fact, has done more harm than good. What would have been the appropriate government response?
What should we have done? And what should we have done in response to this terrible recession? First of all, we should never have created Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the first place, right? This idea that we have 100% guarantees, taxpayer guarantees, your money, my money, your money, guaranteeing other people's mortgages, that simply was ripe for fraud. And we saw that whole model explode. And by the way, we tried to reform that program. We wrote for 15 years about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac at the Wall Street Journal. And we were called scaremongers, every dirty word. You know who was the biggest defender of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Barney Frank. Barney Frank, the guy who wrote the financial reform bill. So we should have done that. What I would have done in the face of that recession is I would have put in place an emergency flat tax. I would have cut every tax rate in the United States to 10%, and I would have kept the rates down there as low as possible until we were out of the recession. Then I would have raised them to 18%, and I would not have run up the national debt by $5 trillion. That has only put us in a bigger hole, and that's a debt that is going to be paid off by future generations, that it's going to take 20, 50, 100 years to pay off that debt. And I don't see how, if you have a debt crisis, how incurring even more debt makes you stronger.
I knew you couldn't do it. I don't trust you, so I'm not going to ask you another question. Would you join me in thanking Stephen?